Welcome to Being and Becoming Podcast. Together, we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading, and the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer, and today we pick back up with an exciting conversation we left off last week in Chapter 4 of Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. This specific section we're about to get into borders more on religious significance as he brings us up towards the end of chapter 4. So to tee you guys off, he kind of goes into religion as being seen as proper behavior, and then your actions most accurately reflect your beliefs as opposed to what you're saying. And then he also goes into the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament, and how this Old Testament God appears to be harsh, judgmental, dangerous, but then the God of the New Testament appears to be more of this all good, loving, merciful, almost hipster-esque kind of guy. So I know you guys probably have a ton of thoughts on this, so I'd love to kick it one of your ways to either here push back on that statement or to draw it out more fully.
So Peterson himself mentions how, the distinction between Old and New Testament seems a bit overstated, exaggerated by commentators, he says. And I just kind of wanted to start a discussion on that because starting in 2020, I started writing down the Bible. Started in Genesis, and I'm currently in Deuteronomy. And I say that to say that it's been an amazing experience of just kind of going word for word, story for story, command for command, and kind of seeing how God presents himself to his people, how God pursues his people, and sets boundaries for his people, and punishes his people, and it's just not matching up. Like, what I'm reading is not matching up with what many people classify the Old Testament God as: a wrathful, vengeful being. I don't think that's quite right, and I think another component of this over-exaggeration of Old Testament and New Testament God is we have a problem seeing the Jewishness of Jesus. And once we forget about the Jewishness of Jesus, we forget that he has fulfilled the law, that he has had, mad respect. He's Jewish. He's, the fulfillment, the son of David, all of those things. So, I see the Old Testament God as a God seeking to redeem humanity through using his chosen people as the example relationship of a human with him, a human people with him.
But Austin, it's the devil's advocate here, and if this God was seeking so hard to redeem the people all throughout the Old Testament, why was there so much bloodshed and so many evil things happening in the world? If God was surely good and merciful, then why was there so much suffering? Again, devil's advocate here.
Yeah, for
teeing
sure.
You up.
Are you assuming that the suffering is God's fault?
Yes, you have to be. In that situation.
Yeah, let me think what that person would say, or what the argument would be. So, yeah, I guess you would have to assume that, right? If you're saying, why would he let all of these things happen? Yeah, I guess that would be the most natural
I think the
conclusion.
question is, why didn't he start over after Adam and Eve? Why didn't he wipe out all of humanity from the flood? Why didn't he kill all humanity at Tower of Babel? Like, you can choose to see only the suffering and the destruction and attribute that to God, or you can see God's patience.
Yeah.
His plan one was to have a relationship through Adam and Eve. That didn't quite work out. Plan two was to pursue his people, and make it as an example to all the nations, and that didn't quite work out completely either, but that was plan three fulfilled by Jesus, And I kind of really only see a merciful God in that light. I mean, of course, we can talk about the harsh things we see in the Old Testament, but, I mean, I think it's really important to see it in the right context.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. And it's always
that's
hilarious to me when someone's like, when Israel, like, absolutely decimates a population or something like that, like, they were all about to die themselves if they didn't actually have God's backing or support, rather. So it's like, why even in an atheist world would you just lay down and let yourself get killed? That's what critics of the Bible are expecting the Israelites to have done when they critique God and all the wars and everything like that.
And if I could weigh in against my own devil's advocate argument too, based on what you're saying, Pat, it's kind of a privileged position to look in the past that way, to say like, why would all these bad things happen? And you're discounting the fact that people overcame those adversities and that they've made the world better for future generations in doing so.
And there's one more comment I want to make on that. Just really kind of looking closely at the law. When I read the Torah, I don't really see, it's not all about ethnic purity. It's about covenant faithfulness.
Yeah.
So I think there's a huge difference between Yahweh's pursuit of Israel and like Hitler pursuing a pure Aryan race. Like, huge difference.
Yeah.
Like, there are specific laws saying care for the foreigner, saying pay the hired worker fairly, even saying this is how you marry someone who's a foreigner correctly. Like, wow, it's about covenant faithfulness, not just about ethnic purity. Like, the distinction's important, right? But that really encouraged me when I kind of discovered that, with my own eyes.
Yeah, wow, that's not only is that a good distinction, that's probably a profound distinction to make too. I think there's difficulties viewing the Bible or any of those old stories with the Western lens, post-Enlightenment, looking back, trying to instill your values into a very different culture at that time. So, well said, Austin.
Absolutely. Any other critiques?
Are there any healthy distinctions to make between an Old Testament God and a New Testament God?
As if they were two separate things?
Yeah, that's probably getting off on the wrong foot.
Well, could I say the obvious? State the obvious first?
Please.
Well, the difference between Old Testament, New Testament God, you could, like, if you wanted to make that distinction, again, like, I think all of us are kind of rolling our eyes not liking those terms because it's the same God, but you see God incarnate in the New Testament, which is something we didn't, outside of, I guess you could say you didn't even see him incarnate in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, although he was present. So, but I guess maybe...
Right on, Logan, right on.
But, yeah, so New Testament, we have God incarnate now, which I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on, too, because when you can tangibly see God and connect with God, relate with God, in that he's a human, does that change your perception of him as just by nature, because now he's incarnate form, he seems less vindictive because he has a personality and he, etc. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
That question is so deep, I can't even. That's a really good question.
That is a really good question.
So you're talking about the profundity of the incarnation and what it means. Oh gosh, I would need to break that down with a few more questions.
Yeah, no, definitely. And maybe it's something we even come back to later in this discussion or another podcast or something, because I literally just thought of it on the spot and thought I'd throw it out there, but I know I don't have a good answer, or I don't have a good way of explaining a complicated idea like that.
Could you more succinctly ask the question again?
Yeah, I guess to be more direct, it would be, does the fact that God is incarnate in the form of Jesus in the New Testament, does that make him seem less vindictive because he's more personable in human form? He's less abstract, maybe?
I guess not necessarily, because just the style that we see Jesus in the Gospels is way different than the style we see Old Testament writing. So let's see. I don't know. I guess
Well, I feel like to put it bluntly, is God's holiness diminished when he becomes a human?
And of course not.
I think...
Of course not, but...
I think the way I'm thinking about it or phrasing the question is almost the opposite of that. It makes him seem more holy or more revenant because you can put a face to the name and he is in person. You know what I mean?
Loving,
like,
or just loving.
He appears more loving because it's like I can see him, I can hug him, I can talk to him, like without as much of a divide as there would have been before.
Only on surface level reading. When
you're
that's
not fair.
Trying to actually understand could you say that probably.
Yeah.
I think Philippians 2 informs this quite well.
Which part?
Speaking of Christ's humility bringing upon his ultimate supremacy. So the humility is actually not like a defiling of his holiness. It's actually in his self-emptying, in his, God himself becoming human. Does he ascend to the highest?
Came to suffer what we've created.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, isn't that?
I've never thought of it that way, Patrick.
It's
suffering as a human creation.
It's crazy to think about it.
That's good.
Yeah. I've thought about that a few times, which is unbelievable. As Austin said earlier, that demonstrates, one, God's patience, but two, our freedom.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, relationship.
Yeah. And we were born to create, to make things. This is up to this point. This is, as a human race, this is what we have built and developed. And Jesus came to suffer at the hands of our creation. We're creationists too. Not in the same magnitude, but
we're just imitating, right? we're whereas God, being the creator, it's almost innate in us or ingrained in us to want to. I have a friend that talks about that actually. That's a really cool point. Especially I would say we're all pretty creative, but I've always enjoyed the songwriting, story writing, trying to create different worlds or ideas or exploring. So, and those sort of endeavors make me feel close to God because of that. It feels like I'm trying to imitate my Father, or whatever. But
especially when you're doing it for the purpose of glorifying Him, then that all the more magnifies that innate drive in all of us.
Yeah. that desire.
What did you all think of the Nietzsche quote?
Oh,
A
Beyond
page
Good and
later.
Evil.
Beyond Good and Evil. Would we do well to read that here?
We would.
Do you mind reading it? I have it pulled up too, Austin, but
I don't mind reading it as long as you're not tired of hearing my voice.
Never.
Never.
That's never gonna happen.
Yeah.
all the
I'll test
listeners
you.
are like, we're tired of all three of you guys.
So I'll be honest from the get-go. I'll need some help interpreting this because I want to see what you guys thought of it because I didn't think it came across super clearly to me, but it's definitely worth discussing. So Nietzsche, in his famous book Beyond Good and Evil, writes, in the Jewish Old Testament, the book of divine justice, there are men, things, and speeches on such a grand style that Greek and Indian literature has nothing to compare it with. One stands with fear and reverence before those stupendous remains of what man was formerly, and one has sad thoughts about old Asia and its little outpushed peninsula Europe. To have bound up this New Testament, a kind of rococo of taste in every respect, along with the Old Testament into one book as the Bible, as the book in itself, is perhaps the greatest audacity and sin against the spirit which literary Europe has on its conscience.
Oof. Boy.
So is Nietzsche saying the Old Testament and New Testament were never meant to be bound together?
I think that's a tempting conclusion based on the first read. But I'm also thinking he probably had a point he was making there.
Yeah.
And is that to circle back to what we were talking about earlier, is he pointing out that there's such a difference in the character of God between the Old Testament and New Testament that they shouldn't have been put together? Is that your guys' interpretation, or?
I'm not sure.
Maybe he thinks it's been put together in a way where the New Testament diminishes the Old Testament and its significance. Because he says the Jewish Old Testament. You know, speeches of grand style and divine justice. So he speaks highly of the Old Testament, to be sure.
Yeah, and I think it's funny too. Earlier, I don't remember which chapter it was now that we had already discussed. Peterson makes a point of how we didn't view the world that we encompass as a world of things until the Enlightenment. And then here's Nietzsche saying, there are men, things, and speeches. But I'm assuming it's, I'm splitting hairs.
That's actually...
because he's probably just saying, like, the things that are encompassing in, you know, in that story. Like,
I think the confusing part about this quote is that he never actually says anything about the New Testament.
Yeah, that's true.
To define it.
yeah, that's really true, because we're inferring what he means. We know that he reveres the Old Testament as a book of divine justice. He states it as clearly as that. Would you, or could I pose it to you guys this way? Would you, maybe by Nietzsche's estimation or by your own, would the book of the New Testament, or I shouldn't say book, would the New Testament be seen as the book of redemption, or what would be your guys's, from Nietzsche's perspective, how do you think he would see that? I know we're inferring here, but, or maybe how would you see that?
I think he sees God going soft.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe it's a book of romance then? By his the way he would understand it. It seems more of the God stepping down, pursuing the humankind that he's created. Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. If only we could phone him.
Yeah.
Give him a little call.
Have him on as a guest.
And we're joined by Nietzsche. Yeah. Nietzsche. Hear what you're thinking, bud.
Care to explain yourself?
To be honest, I'm not sure that would help us understand any better. He was a profound dude.
Yeah, he'd be talking circles around us, and I was like, wait, let's go back to the first thing you said there. Didn't quite catch that. And he's like, you never will. Don't worry about it.
Well, he has a quote where he's like, I can sum up in a sentence what scholars take a whole book to write.
Wow.
Huh. Whoa. That's bad.
And all those scholars are like, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. I'm just about to publish a book. Don't say it.
Yeah. And I think the practical reason to talk about Nietzsche for one more second is he was ill. So it took him a lot of energy to write anything. So he would sit in his chair, think and postulate, and then he would write down the culmination of hours, if not days of thinking, So that was, not just a quote of pride, but, of practice as well.
Why would someone like him, who has such this great literary mind and thinker, and why could he not understand the biblical story how we do?
Oh, that's a good question.
I could take a shot at that if you want.
Please do.
To try. I think he would say, well, I shouldn't even say that. Oh, gosh. There's too much good and evil to see any sort of good throughout all of it. So he kind of had like, I should stop talking.
So,
I haven't read enough Nietzsche.
I haven't either, so I definitely can't speak for him. But let's just...
Listener, maybe that's the next book review we do, or maybe a book review in the future. Or this isn't a review; it's a discussion. But.
If we were to continue with that train of thought and just quote unquote assume that's what he would say, you can rephrase it and say he's just angry at God that he's allowing evil, and therefore there wouldn't be a loving God. Maybe that's why he's not a believer or something. Maybe.
He's too skeptical or cynical, maybe? Is that... Or it's not even that. It's just he's saying there's too much evil to trace this goodness back to anything.
Yeah, that's a good way to... That's another good way to say it, yeah.
Okay. Because I think this could tie into what Jordan's talking about in this chapter with setting your aim and like where you're looking, because that could be a temptation to view the world through only the evil and to not find the traces of any goodness. But then if you find yourself there and maybe you're starting to become nihilistic, going back to our previous talks, then maybe it's a matter of setting your eyes on one good thing, even if it's a low thing, quote unquote low.
Yeah.
But something that's good that you think is worth doing, and then you do that thing, and then you kind of start building up your trust with yourself and with the world around you, and then you start setting your aim higher. I don't know if maybe to tie Nietzsche back into with what we're reading, maybe that could relate in some way.
Yeah, it could. It's hard to say without actually knowing what he means and without talking to the guy, but
it would be crazy to get Jordan's thoughts on that, because I bet he would have some very
it would
profound and well articulated ideas in that area.
It also relates to what we were talking about, how we feel like people misinterpret the Old Testament God, Like, you can just choose to see him as the God who causes all this suffering, or you could, it's kind of like where your perspective lies.
And I think it's funny you bring that up, Austin, because Nietzsche, based on what we're, reading in that quote, almost is attributing to God some form of justice, and he's viewing him as just, which someone else who's more critical of the Old Testament would say he's unfair, probably. Like, going back to my devil's advocate up top, that someone with that maybe sort of perspective would view quote unquote Old Testament God as unjust, whereas even Nietzsche, if he is being maybe critical of the world or of human nature or even of God, is saying at least the God of the Old Testament is just, which almost seems to conflict or contradict the statement of the other kind of critical mind.
I was going to say, does this paragraph, right under the quote, have anything to do with Nietzsche's, or whatever, his perspective?
Yeah, so that's kind of, I think, the two paragraphs under the Nietzsche quote. And for the listener at home, if you have a Jordan Peterson book, 12 Rules for Life, with you, it's on page
106.
106. And it's below the Nietzsche quote. But to answer your question, Pat, I think the two paragraphs below talk about the setting the aim, or determining your aim, and how it shouldn't be at something petty. So and that's kind of what I was trying to tie in potentially with maybe Nietzsche's aim was too low. It wasn't aiming at something better. But I also could be wrong in interpreting that. Or maybe I'm splitting hairs.
No, I think Peterson takes a good opportunity to relate it to personal living and perspective. And as we were talking about, like, can you choose to see only the suffering, or will you choose to aim higher, as Logan was saying? So a quote that I liked was, instead of cursing the darkness, let in a little light.
Yeah, I wrote that one down too. Because, so before, my memory's getting jogged by what you're just saying, Austin. So before the quote, he relayed an example about a boss and how it's easy to become disgruntled towards the boss or upset with them. And then you just start seeing everything they do, you're seeing the negative attributes of what they're doing instead of recognizing the positive things they do. And he picks that example back up after the Nietzsche quote and talks about that the aforementioned envy for your boss or whatever, because they have a nicer office or nicer perks or whatever, nicer salary, whatever. But then if you start thinking in that frame of mind consistently, Peterson's kind of making the point where you're only gonna dwell in unhappiness. So you should probably reconsider, your own lot or even what this person has, because they could have the perfect job, but they could have a ruinous marriage. And, like, your marriage could be great, and you just are kind of upset with your job, or you wish the job was better. So to kind of what I think, Austin, you were talking about this earlier, the perspective that you can have is so important. Yeah, when you were talking about the Old Testament and how, maybe you should even view that as a God that's continually trying to redeem the people of Israel and to have a relationship with them, instead of viewing that whole book as a vindictive God that's out to kill and murder and allows murdering and rape and all these other atrocities.
Dang.
I don't see the Old Testament God ever wanting evil.
Yeah, ever.
Yeah. No, I know that's definitely not a point I'm trying to make, but I was just saying, like, you
Sorry.
as someone reading, like, if the devil's advocate from earlier, like, if that person was reading the Old Testament and they're reading about all of these sacrifices they have to do that don't make sense to the Western enlightened mind, you know, like having to cut sheep open and blood and
Okay.
herbs you're burning, you know, all that sort of thing just can't compute. And why would God require that of someone? Do you see kind of what I'm saying as far as why someone could view God in that way? I'm not saying that you should or that any of us view God that way, but
Well, you've said it multiple times. It's all about the lens that you're looking through. It's not going to make near as much sense to the 21st century person in the West, but these ideas of sacrifices weren't new at all. In fact, they didn't even begin with Israel. They preceded Israel by hundreds of years. At the same time of Noah, people were sacrificing. There's all these evil sacrifices that the neighboring countries are making. Tons of things making them sick, which is why there were purity laws around their sacrificing. Trying to think what else.
Yeah, don't drink blood.
Yeah.
Don't sacrifice children. A lot of these were like actually stating some of the practices that were going on and have been going on.
And honing them in and making them holy and all these things. Plus the idea of sacrifice, not necessarily of an animal, but just the concept of sacrificing definitely wasn't new when the law came out, when we get these specific instructions. So you really don't even, this is so, I guess, rude to say, for a non-believer picking it up for the first time and then reading that and then questioning it, it's like, sure, most people are there, but it's just like you're not thinking very hard when you critique that. Like,
I think that's entirely fair. But how else can you?
Yeah,
think,
I was gonna.
You know, outside of your.
Yes, I was gonna say it's the unfortunate starting point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't want to stay
there.
You don't want to.
Yes.
I think a nightmare of my own would be that I'm reading the Bible the same way 10 years from now that I was 20 years
Exactly.
ago. I don't want that to be. I want to have a deep relationship with God and a better understanding of the world around me and of people and everything. So I want it to be a more profound experience 10 years from now than it was 20 years ago when I was reading something for the first time, or you know.
And if the new Christian, even, because I know new Christians struggle with this all the time, if you read that for the first time, you're not sure what to do with it, definitely ask the question, but don't just ask it to show you're higher than it. Like, actually pursue the question, and you'll find an answer, many answers, and then that's just going to further lead you down the way, the right path, for lack of a better term. So yeah,
that's great advice, Pat.
As I was reading about Peterson's advice for seeking a better attitude, for, you know, trying to look for light, trying to readjust your goals, and like talking about kind of making your life better and making your life better for, you know, your close relationships. And it just really reminded me of Jesus' statement when he says, the kingdom of God is within you. Like, oh wow. The good news of the kingdom can start with our own attitudes and actions, and can
yes, that's
we can make his kingdom the reality in the suffering world with our own actions.
Bring heaven to earth. You can do that.
Well, and
right
that's
now.
Austin, that's encouraging for many reasons, but also from the standpoint with the way it relates to this book, because then it's I have power over my situation to do something about it. You know what I mean?
Yes, good point.
If I have the Spirit of God within me, empowering me, what excuse do I have left to not, make my bed, or like whatever the thing is. And that's not saying that you're going to succeed at everything, but as we talked about, I think in our last session, how, failure is a good teacher. It's like there's a spectrum of success and failure. It's not just, I might have failed at something that I tried and I shouldn't do it anymore. It's no, what did I learn from that? What am I moving towards because of that, or what am I moving away from because of that? And that's good, because the worst thing would be to not try anything, or to not care about anything, or to not do anything. That's your worst possible thing. Than to try something and to fail. That's natural. That's every day. But you're never really going to be able to appreciate your successes if you're not moving, trying, trusting God, failing, trying again. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like that's encouraging. I'm so glad you said that. It got me all fired up.
I've heard this in a podcast, and I think I read it in his book, the T.S. Eliot excerpt that Peterson mentions about in the cocktail party.
Oh, is that in the intro to the book?
I can't remember, but the story he summarizes the story with there's a therapist, and he's at a party and he meets this woman and she has a question, hopefully, getting something from his, background in psychology. She said, I have to know if my problems are because of me or if it's because of the world, and she was like, please let it be because of me. And he's like, why? Like, why do you wish that there was problems with you? And she was like, because I can't fix the world. Because that means I just throw my hands up and I can't do anything. I hope there's something wrong with me because I don't like the way that my life is going. And I think that aligns with the kingdom of God is within you, like in Matthew 6, Jesus is talking about, don't worry about the clothes that you wear. Don't worry about tomorrow. For there's enough evil in the world. Seek first the kingdom. I've been very recently encouraged just by this idea of the kingdom of God. And so it's not just about a ticket to heaven because Jesus resurrected, but it's about, the good news of the kingdom of God and the family that we get to be a part of.
Rock and roll.
Yeah, and think of how much better where you spend your time the most, like with your family. If everyone was unified in bringing heaven to earth, the kingdom of God here right now, how much more joyful conversation would be, how much more love would be in the air, just how worry and stress would probably fade away. Not that worry and stress would be non-existent, but that unified with that group, you'd be trusting in something different ahead. So
this book is titled An Antidote to Chaos, but it really often is an antidote to nihilism as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I wish we had a real harsh non-believer here to ask us the questions that they don't understand.
Yeah.
Because since we've pursued and explored the Bible so much, I'm, I guess, naively maybe at the point where I'm just like, I don't see any other way making sense. Period.
Well, and I think that's a great idea, Pat. Maybe we could have someone on with that's less agreeable and has a more contentious point of view. So, listener at home, if you know any people that you'd like us to see have a conversation with, or that could provide a little more pushback on some of these ideas, feel free to email us, and that info will be at the end of the podcast if you want to connect and have any suggestions.
Or even a young Christian. Because, they'll go through those questions, those thoughts, those critiques themselves. You come by them naturally, like you were saying earlier, Logan. Those are going to be the human responses to these things. But if you actually meaningfully pursue it, you'll get somewhere instead of just surface level critiquing.
When Peterson talks about faith and how faith is not childish belief in magic, but rather it's something more closer to the realization that tragic irrationalities in life must be counterbalanced by an equally irrational commitment to essential goodness of being. That hit me pretty hard. And those are pretty much direct quotes from what he was saying. But something I liked on page 107 that he said is, act as if existence might be justified by its goodness.
Yes.
And that hit me like a ton of bricks as I was reading it.
Yeah.
Because it's tempting for, if you're filled with resentment, arrogance, or if you're, nihilistic about this life or capital B being, act as if existence might be justified by its goodness. That, I don't know how to live that out every day, but that seems like something worthwhile to aim at,
Absolutely. There's one, another quote of Jordan that he's quoting Jesus regarding aim that I really like at the end. It's just the classic, knock and the door will open, ask and you'll receive. There is so much dang stuff there. Well, I can't get into it too much, but I'm not saying I have that much to say about that. That's an odd. You can take that truly as the summary for compare yourself to who you were today, not to who someone else is today. You have to twist it a little bit, but dang.
No, I like that a lot, Pat.
And Logan, when you're talking about, what was the quote again? You were reading the irrationalities.
Oh, wait. With faith. So Peterson kind of defined, and I would be curious to get some pushback on this because I don't know if I've quite wrapped my mind around this part either. But Peterson was saying that faith is essentially like the realization that tragic irrationalities of life. So I take that to mean like, why is there evil in the world, or why do bad things happen to good people? Things like that must be counterbalanced by an equally irrational commitment to essential goodness of being.
Okay, so that right there is forgiveness. That's what forgiveness does.
Can you elaborate?
Okay. Irrational commitment to what did he say?
Where's what page is the quote on?
Sorry, it's the quote's on 107, I believe. Or it could be end of 106. It's somewhere in there. Sorry, Austin, what was your question?
So, tragic irrationalities on the dark side, and then an irrational commitment to goodness on the other side?
Essential goodness, yeah.
Essential goodness. Yeah, so... Yeah, I mean, I think he's kind of talking about redeeming the tragedy of life, or finding things worth setting the suffering of life against.
Wow, yes.
And I think forgiveness is a really good example of this, because when there's a serious case of forgiveness, this person is faced with tragic irrationalities, maybe their child was killed in a drunk driving accident. That is like, you can't comprehend the tragedy of that. That's what that quote's saying. You can't comprehend this kind of tragedy, But, how easy is it to be caught in a world of resentment for the rest of your life,
Yes.
Or is there any possible way for you to, over time, maybe see the humanity of that other individual, and see what Jesus did, for our sins to bring us closer in relationship to Him, because we were, sinned against him. So yeah, I don't want to I don't want to do the whole cheesy forgiveness situation, but I just thought that forgiveness was a really good example of that quote that you were speaking.
I like that a lot.
And I think, Austin, tying into what you just said, another aspect of the faith piece he was talking about, he said refuse to subjugate your faith to your current rationality.
Wow.
So in those situations maybe where it is, you're overcome with grief or sorrow or what have you.
Wow.
You can still understand how narrow your perspective is. Even though you're overcome with these really justified and true emotion or true rationalities,
Yep.
or what, you can be entirely right and still miss the whole point. You know what I mean? You can justify in your mind that you should feel and you can feel and you will feel these things. You can justify that and then miss the whole point altogether. Thank you for tuning in to this week's book club discussion. Please let us know if you have any suggestions as to books we should read or topics we should discuss by contacting us at beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you join us next week for another conversation.